Okay, now we're going to go through Systems Analysis and Design Chapter 2. In the chapter Objectives, we're going to explain the concepts of a business case and how a business case affects an IT project. We're going to describe the planning process and why it is important to the IT team. We're going to explain the purpose of the mission statement. We're going to conduct a SWOT analysis and describe the factors involved. And we're going to explain how the systems development lifecycle serves as a framework for systems development. Continuing on, we're going to list the reasons for system projects and factors that affect such projects, describe systems requests and the role of the Systems Review Committee, define operational, technical, economic, and schedule feasibility, describe the steps and the end product of a preliminary investigation. So, as an introduction, analysts must consider the company's mission statement, objectives, and IT needs. The process starts with a systems request. Not always here. Depending on the type of project, yes, it might. If it's a major system enhancement, I don't think someone's going to write up a system request for it. Not in anything I've experienced. That's usually part of a company-wide procedure, so I don't know that a systems request works there. Preliminary investigation follows to evaluate the feasibility study, fact-finding techniques, and reporting to management. The strategic planning overview starts with a mission statement, continues with goals and objectives, and these long-term and short-term goals are identified. What is a SWOT analysis? So a SWOT analysis, before I go on and go through the slides here, SWOT analysis exists in management and marketing. Now you can see them in IT. It simply stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So going forward, an enterprise SWOT analysis usually begins with these questions. What are our strengths? How can we use them to achieve our goals? What are our weaknesses? What can we do about this? What are our opportunities, and how do we plan to take advantage of them? And then we ask, what are our threats, and how can we assess, manage, and respond to the possible risks? Here's a framework and a SWOT analysis of a corporate patent. You can look this over yourself. This kind of gives you an idea of how a SWOT analysis can appear and be conducted. Strategic planning for IT projects. Careful planning can help assure that the project supports the overall business strategy and operational needs. When you're reviewing a vendor's product or something in-house that you're doing, you need to make sure that it works for your business, pure and simple. And the project scope needs to be well defined and clearly stated. We are going to learn about something later on called scope creep, which is common in projects, which is where new project requirements get introduced as the project goes on. We're going to have to see that the project goals are realistic and achievable and tied to specific statements, assumptions, and other inputs. Planning tools. Some analysts use traditional text-based methods like Microsoft Word. Other analysts prefer to use a spreadsheet. However, case tools such as Visible Analyst, which is the example here, are used. Visio is also can be used as a case tool. When I'm doing my planning, I believe, and I've always been able to work with an outline in the past. Initially, I might take it a step further and put it into a case tool. I think when you're doing the preliminary information gathering, though, I think you need to have your bullet points in order when you're doing your planning and know that each of the bullet points is going to be covered. A new role for the IT department. Management and IT are closely linked, and remarkable changes have occurred in both areas. Today, systems development is much more teams-oriented. In every systems development task I've ever been presented with, it's been a team approach. When you're working in an IT department, you have to look at the end users and employees in other departments, you have to look at them as the customers. And when you work with these upgrades, we have to work with them as a team to make sure that we know what they want and they know what we're capable of presenting and providing. Although team-oriented development is the norm, some companies see the role of the IT department being screened in evaluating systems requests. I think that's changing quite a bit. I think most people know that they need to work with a business analyst and a systems analyst to put these projects together. Larger firms are more likely to use an evaluation team or a system review committee. And that's very true. And committees can sometimes slow things down, so a lot of times in a larger firm, these new developments and these systems don't get put together as quickly and as easily. What is a business case? A business case refers to the reasons or justification for a proposal. It should be comprehensive yet easy to understand. It should describe the project clearly, provide the justification to proceed, and estimate the project's financial impact. What is a business case? So it needs to answer these simple questions. Why are we doing this? What is this about? How does this solution address key business issues? We have to consider cost and time and what kind of productivity loss you'll suffer in the transition. And I think there is always a productivity loss, but I think nowadays we've come pretty close where we can actually cut the systems over pretty quickly and pretty effectively. I think some of the productivity loss comes into play when we have things like meetings and development tasks, task force, and the team-oriented stuff. That requires getting together and meeting, and while you're doing that, sometimes you can't be as productive. A business case should also answer, what is the return on investment? What are the risks? What are the risks in not doing it? And how will we measure success, and are there any alternatives? Now let's talk about my favorite, systems requests. The main reasons for systems requests are improved performance, that's customer service or users within the company, so they have a system where they can track and monitor things, support for new products and services, and better performance. So you can track a system request. If the system doesn't work the way you want it to or do what you want, you can tweak it and make it perform better. So these are all reasons for the systems request. Here is a very simple sample. Hold on, let me straighten this out just a little bit there. Let me go through some of this. Like right here, I was saying it says new system. I do not think you'd see a system request in a form similar to this for something like that. It's too big of a task. It requires too much rather than a systems request. Again, a systems review committee is a committee with a broader viewpoint, and it can establish priorities more effectively than an individual. And one person's bias isn't likely to control the entire project. And like I said, the disadvantages in committees are you have to wait for the committee, certain projects may be favored over others by a committee, and of course there's always political infighting. I don't feel office politics are covered enough in MBA programs and master's degree programs. Office politics is huge, and it always has been, so I think that's an important thing to continue on and discuss, but when you're dealing with the committee, internal politics is huge. And if someone says it's not, that's just not true. Next, we're going to have an overview of feasibility. Is the proposal desirable in an operational sense? Is it practical? Will it solve a problem or take advantage of an opportunity? Is the proposal technically feasible? Do we have the necessary technical resources and people for the project? At Alberta's here, for example, I know our IT department is very Windows oriented, and Linux projects sometimes are not feasible because we don't have the staff to accommodate the needs of of the projects in all cases. So people and the skill set of the people are important to consider. Also, different companies have different cost structures and different amounts of money they're able to budget towards this sort of thing. If you can't afford to begin the project, you probably shouldn't, because it won't work, pure and simple. Are other intangible factors involved, such as customer satisfaction or company image? Will this be a good investment? Will this make things work? That's pretty self-explanatory. Can the proposal be accomplished within an acceptable time frame? This is something that's also a feasibility consideration. So you have to look at operational, economic, technical, and schedule. And these are some of the factors that make this project feasible or not feasible. So operational feasibility. Is the project supported by management? Do the users want it? Is the current system well liked and effectively used? Do users see a need for change? I think there's some interesting points to discuss here. Is the current system well liked and effectively used? I don't think too many people would really say that they like their ERP system. I think people always find issues with it. However, sometimes the replacement isn't as good as the problem. I've seen issues where people were using an older vendor system that was terminal based, where they could use the tab key and do their data entry really, really quickly. And then we gave them a new nice Windows system with all the bells and whistles, and it looked nice with the cut and paste. But the tabbing feature wasn't as good, and they weren't able to use the hotkeys, where they had to start using the mouse, and it actually slowed them down. So you have to also ask, do the users see a need for change, and is the current system well liked and effectively used, as opposed to what? So these are the kind of things that really, really do require a lot of consideration. Will the new system result in a workforce reduction? If so, what will happen to the affected employees? Computers involve automation. Unfortunately, automation can involve job loss. If your new system requires a lot more employees to facilitate, and it doesn't have a whole lot of new features, it might not be worth doing. Will the new system require training for users? If so, is the company prepared to provide the necessary resources for training employees? I think you always have to retrain employees. I think that goes with the territory. Will users be involved in planning the new system right from the start? That's something else to consider, and you will want to work with operational users as well as management at all the levels. That's something that's important. Let's look at organizational feasibility now. Will the new system place any demands on users or require any operating changes? For example, will any information be less accessible or produced less frequently? When you're switching systems or you're modifying or upgrading a vendor's product, those are important questions. Will the performance decline in any way? If so, will the overall gain to the organization outweigh the individual losses? That was the question I asked with the terminal-based GUI as a system, as opposed to the graphical user system with the mouse and what have you. Will customers experience adverse effects in any way, either temporarily or permanently? That's important to consider. I remember when I got switched from AT&T Uverse to Frontier, and I lost my DNS. That was out for like 2 days. Hurt the image. To this day, I remember that. Will any risk to the company's image or goodwill result? Does the development schedule conflict with other company priorities? This is really common when you determine the development schedule at a college. There are different events that occur at a college throughout the year. There's registration, there's grading, there's different mods, there's different terms, and all that needs to be considered. You don't want to have a system upgrade on the opening day of registration. That's a classic example right there. Do legal or ethical issues need to be considered? Again, in a student information system, financial aid, you want to keep the system up to date because you want to make sure that you've got things upgraded and that you've introduced modern and up-to-date systems, because legal and ethical issues do need to be considered, especially with financial aid. Next, we'll look at technical feasibility. Does the company have the necessary hardware, software, and network resources? If not, can those resources be easily acquired? That's pretty self-explanatory, and I've kind of covered that already, so I'll go on. Does the company have the needed technical expertise? Can it be acquired? That really kind of depends on the technical expertise you're looking for. A lot of times yes, a lot of times no. If you're looking for somebody with general Windows or networking knowledge, it can probably be acquired. If you're looking for somebody with specific product knowledge, that would be harder to find. Does the proposed platform have sufficient capacity for future needs? If not, can it be expanded? So you want to allow for growth, pure and simple. Technical feasibility. Will a prototype be required? Will the hardware and software environment be reliable? Will it integrate with other company information systems, both now and in the future? Will it interface properly with external systems operated by customers and suppliers? Will the combination of hardware and software supply adequate performance? Do clear expectations and performance specifications exist? Will the system be able to handle future transaction volume and company growth? So, all important considerations. Now we'll look at the economic feasibility. So there's costs for people. That includes IT staff and users. You have to purchase hardware. You're going to have software licensing as well as in-house development costs from your staff. And you're going to have lots of vendor purchases to consider. Cost for formal and informal training, including peer-to-peer support. So, like I said, you're going to have to teach them how to use the new project and the new system. Cost of licensing and fees. Costs of consulting expenses. There's always a consultant when you're dealing with a vendor that will address your specific needs. Facility costs. And then you also have to consider the cost of not developing the system or postponing the project. So a lot of times, again, if you students can't receive financial aid because the project was postponed and the upgrades weren't done, that's not okay. Next, we want to compare the tangible benefits with the intangible benefits. So sometimes this user-friendliness can hurt job satisfaction, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it helps. For a middle manager or an upper manager, I would think the user-friendly interface would be nice, but for the operational employees, maybe not so much. You know, there's these different benefits. I'll let you look those over. Schedule feasibility. Can the company or the IT team control the factors that affect the schedule of feasibility? Has management established a firm timetable for the project? What conditions must be satisfied during the development of the system? Will an accelerated schedule pose any risks? If so, are these risks acceptable? I think any accelerated schedule can pose risks because when the development occurs rapidly, it can occur sloppily. It might work, but then future enhancements might not work so well. I don't like being rushed in coding. I like to code quickly and effectively, but I think you need to take time when you do your coding and make sure it's readable and it's well documented. I always like the term, the code itself is self-documenting. So anyway, will the project management techniques be available to coordinate and control the project? Will a project manager be appointed? That's a very interesting question and concern, something that requires more consideration and discussion later. Next, let's evaluate feasibility. During the feasibility study, it's really the objective to identify and weed out system requests that can't be done, that just aren't going to happen. And even if it is possible to do, it might not be necessary. It might be something that is just going to be an expense and not really bring any benefit. And Requests that are not currently feasible can be resubmitted as new hardware, software, or expertise becomes available. So maybe it's not something that's feasible now, but maybe it's something that'll be feasible in the future. That's what they're referring to here. Now we're going to talk about setting priorities. This is factors that affect priority. Will the proposed system reduce costs? Will it increase revenue? Will the systems project result in more information or better results? Will the system serve the customer better? Will the system serve the organization better? Can the project be implemented in a reasonable time period? And are the necessary financial, human, and technical resources readily available? Oftentimes, banks will evaluate something like this, and banks, they are very risk and security oriented, and change moves very slowly because they have so many committees and so many different pieces of oversight. A lot of bank systems are older because they don't really see the way it'll increase revenue. They might not see how a new system can reduce costs. I see banks being very slow to accept these system requests, and other institutions are much quicker about it. That's just an observation I've made, but different priorities exist differently within different organizations, but these are the factors. So there's also non-discretionary projects and discretionary projects. Discretionary projects are projects where management has a choice in implementing them. So a discretionary project might be creating a new report for a user. It's something that would make their lives easier, it would increase their productivity, but it's not something that's keeping the system from operating. It's not something that's holding up the company right now. So non-discretionary projects are projects where management has no choice but to implement them. And here at Albertus, I go back to financial aid. That's always the best example. Adding a report required by federal law, all kinds of federal financial aid reports. Most of these projects are predictable. So there's payroll changes, there's tax changes, there's all kinds of regulatory quarterly changes. In the student information system type, you also have to add financial aid to that. However, the taxes, that sort of consideration is always in there as well. So those are the examples of non-discretionary projects, or projects that if you wait too long to upgrade your system, sometimes you won't get these updates from the vendor, and that's a consideration. Part of the preliminary investigation overview involves the interaction with managers and users. You meet with key managers, users, and IT staff to describe the project, explain responsibility, answer questions, and invite comments. This is the time where you want to focus on improvements and enhancements and not the current problems. The current problems might exist because these improvements or enhancements don't exist, and the problems are problems in the old system. They might not be problems in the new system. So this is the kind of thing that you want to get started with. This is the team-oriented approach that we were talking about. So part of this involves understanding the problem or opportunity, defining the scope and the constraints, fact-finding. You want to review the existing documentation. This is a big one here. Observe operations and conduct a user survey. I've worked with many companies. I've worked in the Office of Development at Yale, and they did a project. In week 1 I mentioned that when a project fails that it hurts really bad and it's really painful. I actually left the development office at Yale before the project failed, but I could see that the writing was on the wall. And where it says observe operations, The people who called themselves SMEs or subject matter experts did not observe the operations. They assumed that they knew. And I did observe the operations, and I could see all kinds of problems with their approach. So fact finding is extremely important, and you have to do it at all levels. And everybody is a customer, and they need to be treated as such, even if it's internal, especially if it's internal. Study usability, cost, benefit, and schedule data. Evaluate feasibility, operational, technical, and economic. We've talked about that. And then you need to present to management. So this is what gets considered: the problem or opportunity, the benefits. The scope needs to be clearly defined because, like I said, scope creep is a real thing and it can kill a project. And costs. Step 1. Understand the problem or opportunity. This is from the figure in the previous slide. Develop a business profile that describes business processes and functions. Understand how modifications will affect business and other systems. Determine which departments, users, and businesses are involved. Business processes are involved. A systems request may not reveal an underlying problem, meaning there could be an issue that exists that's not addressed. Define the scope and the constraints. This is something I've been talking about quite a bit as we've gone on. Define the specific boundaries or the extent of the project. This is hard to do, but it's really important. Somebody's going to come up with something in a part of the project or a section that's going to hit you from left field when you're going through something like this, and these boundaries need to be set, and the extent of the project needs to be set ahead of time. An example of this was when I was working on a conversion in a development office, and midway through a failing project, they decided that it might be a good idea to automate the load of people from the registration system into the alumni system once they graduate. And this is something that the old system did to some degree. However, we were having so many problems with the project that this wasn't something that would have been easy to do as part of the replacement. So they tried to do it. The project was already overrun with time, so those boundaries need to be set. What I was describing isn't something that's out of the ordinary. It's not a request that wasn't feasible. However, due to the constraints that were set on the project, it was something that was too much, and it was something that was introduced as a very late add-on kind of thing. So when you're doing a project scope and constraint, you need to build it into sections: the must do, should do, could do, and won't do. So something like this could have been added here, like I was describing above, but it would have to be foreseen, and it wasn't necessarily foreseen in this case. Define project scope as clearly as possible to avoid project creep. I've discussed this pretty clearly. And identify constraint. A constraint being a condition that the system must satisfy or an outcome that the system must achieve. Then there is the perform fact finding. I've discussed how important it is to conduct interviews and document the interviews and evaluate the interviews. And you need to interview the right people. That's important as well. You need to gather data about project usability, costs, benefits, and schedules. Analyze organization charts. Understand the functions of the person and the person you want to interview. Like I was saying, oftentimes some of the operational employees have some of the best insight. And you have to remember that a lot of times top managers really are concerned with the summary data and the summary information. So A lot of times the operational employees are kind of left out, and they really shouldn't be, and that's one of the best pieces of advice I could give you in one of these type of things. IT works very closely with operational employees in an ERP environment, in an ERP systems environment. You need to review any kind of existing documentation that they may have. Oftentimes, you don't get good documentation depending on the department or the user, but you have to review what you have, and you have to make sure that they give you the latest and greatest information. And this is something I mentioned is important, and I can't say that enough. See how workers carry out typical tasks, because these typical tasks are going to be what are necessary with the old system and the new system. And you'll be able to see where there's weaknesses to what they're doing and strengths, and you might be able to eliminate something, or you may be able to add something that'll make the system better for them. But that is something you want to take care of in the fact-finding process. So I am a huge fan of management by walking around, and by the same token, observing the operations and getting to know what the end user needs to do. That's important at all levels. Conduct a user survey. A survey is not as flexible as a series of interviews, but it's less expensive. It doesn't take that much time, and then you can go ahead and look at the data and go from there. Step 4 is to analyze project usability, cost, benefit, and schedule data. So what information must you obtain, and how will you gather and analyze the information? You have to consider, how are you going to conduct interviews, and if so, with how many people? Are you going to put out surveys? Survey who? How much will it cost? How much time will it take? And you need to figure out how you're going to report this information. So this is quite a bit here in this slide, and in the book it provides much more detail, but step 4 is to analyze project usability, cost, benefit, and schedule data. Step 5 is where we evaluate the feasibility. So that includes operational feasibility, technical, economic, or cost feasibility, and whether it can be scheduled and whether that fits in. And this one I'm going to read the bullet point. It says include stakeholder expectations regarding acceptable timing and completion dates. This really needs to include all stakeholders. Step 6, present the results and recommendations to management. So your typical report needs to be well laid out. It needs to include an introduction, the request summary. You need to list your findings. You need to present a case for action. You need to establish the roles and who's going to be doing what in the project. You need to do time and cost estimates, so you need to have that information ready as to what it's going to cost and how much time is it going to take, and what is the affected benefits, and lastly the appendix. So systems planning is the first phase of the systems development life cycle. A business case should describe the project clearly, provide the justification to proceed, and estimate the project's financial impact. Various internal and external forces and factors affect systems projects, such as user requests, top management directives, existing systems, the IT department, software and hardware vendors, technology, customers, competitors, and the economy and government. Analysts must evaluate systems requests. I'll let you read this last slide here, so thank you.